Welcome to Educational Alpha. I'm Bill Kelly, CEO of Kaya and your host, bringing you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, and industry colleagues from around the globe.
In this episode, Bill catches up with industry titan Stuart MacDonald, chairman of Aaro Capital. Stuart's wealth of experience from over 30 years across top-tier global investment companies, his deep expertise in capital raising across alternative investment management and bankable technologies, his service on varied nonprofit boards, and hosting the award-winning alternative investment radio show, The Naked Short Club, makes for an insightful and fascinating conversation. Listen in.
Stuart, always great to see you.
Well, only a shame that we're separated by an ocean at the moment, but there is always an open door and a table full of food waiting for you here in London. So until the next time.
I look forward to that. So I've been a guest and very happy to have had the invite several times over. I think live once or twice in the studio, and then unfortunately virtually since then. But we're going to get to the Naked Short Club at some point because it's an interesting platform. And I think here on Educational Alpha, I've turned the tables on you where you're in the hot seat and I get to ask all the penetrating questions. So maybe a little bit about who you are. And I've known you a long time, but I really don't know too much about your background myself. So maybe a little bit of thumbnail on Stuart.
Very happy to give it to you. Well, so far as it pertains to this particular conversation, I left university with an economics degree and a great taste for travel, and ultimately found myself being employed by some currency speculators, very slick Mayfair in London based currency speculators, who these days would have been called hedge fund managers. And that gave me my first opportunity to start traveling around the world, which was delightful in my mid-20s. And beyond that, by stages, found myself working my way up corporate hierarchies. I had spells with firms like Buchanan Partners, who in their day were the largest single manager hedge fund group in the world outside of the US. They seemed enormous when they got to just over $800 million AUM. That shows you how early on in the hedge fund industry that was. Over time, ended up having a reasonably purple patch, quite a successful patch with Henderson Global Investors as they then were, well before the takeover of Gartmore and well before the merger with Janus. And we built a multi-billion-dollar single manager hedge fund business pretty much from scratch. It was rather successful and one of the more enjoyable spells in my career. At a certain point, I decided to broaden my competence beyond hedge funds into things like venture capital, private equity, private markets, real assets in that particular sphere, everything from renewable energies through to things related to agriculture. I wanted to move beyond just hedge funds as they began to become somewhat more institutionalized in their form. Then I got to a point where I was pretty much at the end of the road so far as my ability to deal with the exigencies of working for other people. Now, you never escape working for other people, and I'll return to that in a second, but it just got to the point where after about 20 years of people encouraging me to do so, I bit the bullet with a partner, set up a mid-market corporate finance firm headquartered in London with activity all over the world and very expansive ambitions to do a whole variety of corporate finance-related things, ranging from capital raising through to M&A and transactionally related work and corporate advisory work. That was about 10 years ago. By that time, I had got to an age at which an awful lot of people have, frankly, run out of steam with their careers. It is typically the case that people break a certain age with a 4 in front of it, or they break 50, and they start turning to their minds to what are they going to do once they hit 60 and beyond that, or even in their late 50s, because it becomes progressively more difficult, even at a senior level, to find jobs or good ones, simply because there are fewer of them by definition. Pyramids are a certain shape, if you will. Anyone you're competing with is probably very, very good indeed at what they do. Something that I discovered fairly quickly was that you never escape working for other people. They simply change from being your management or your bosses through to being your clients. And if anything, it's even more tyrannous a situation because there's no hiding place when you have a client. You either deliver what they require or you do not. You can't really make excuses. But it's very exhilarating, breaking out, setting yourself free, as it were. It's sort of like jumping out of a plane without a parachute, but never quite landing. And in the meantime, you can do a certain amount to affect the direction or the angle of your fall. And that is very exciting. I don't regret that at all. But almost without realizing it, what I was doing from my 30s onwards was preparing the ground for where I am now. I found that my personal inclinations drew me towards the voluntary sector, a whole number of charities and community organizations. And I found that relatively early compared to a lot of people, I found myself boards as a trustee or in serving on advisory boards, looking at things ranging from financial management through to brand development and fundraising for these different organizations. And what that actually did was it gave me a lot of hands-on experience, the kind of thing that I think many of the people who go through the process of getting the kayak qualification, whether overtly or explicitly or not, are thinking in terms of, what do you do later on? Well, it used to be the case that people like you and I, given our demographics we represent, could have expected at some point to go into semi-retirement or retirement. And as long as we kept our noses clean and shown a reasonable competence, we could have walked into one or two board or non-executive board positions to play out our late 50s or 60s or 70s. That is increasingly not the case, partly because the skill sets and the sensibilities and the sensitivities that are now required in those kind of positions have shifted. And also the demographics being drawn on have shifted or begun to shift far too slowly, I know, in your view and certainly in mine as well. The sooner that we're not even having this part of our conversation, the better. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, bring it on to the point where diversity and empowerment are no longer issues, but we're nowhere near where we need to get to in regard to those things. But where I'm leading with this particular arc, Bill, is that you don't necessarily need to do it through your day job, but the more that you can do, whether wittingly or otherwise, to prepare yourself for the kinds of things that may be available to you as you get older, the better. Now, I myself have ended up in a position whereby much of my time, probably the largest part of my time these days, is devoted to my activity as executive chairman of one of the first authentically institutional quality fund of funds managers in the crypto assets and DLT space. That's Aaro Capital in London. I don't think I've ever worked so hard in my life. My running joke with them is that I'm working 5.5 days out of my 8-day working week for them, because at the same time, I'm still keeping my corporate finance firm going, Bright Valley Partners. And post-Brexit is certainly the case that almost all our activity is outside of the UK. But I've also ended up on some other boards, either as a full board member or as an advisory board member, in areas ranging from hedge funds to so-called green logistics through to the hospitality industry. Well, that's basically a small share in a brilliant wine bar in Soho in London, but I still take some part in management. What is it that prepared me for this? It wasn't just my work in the corporate sector. It was the playing out of the better side of myself in a way, getting involved in the voluntary sector with no motive in terms that smacked of self-aggrandizement at all, or not even a consciousness of developing myself. But that gave me a lot of the kind of experience that you need when you go into a board as you get older, which is the ability to go in somewhere, read it very, very quickly, be very sensitive, to use the term again, the sensibilities of the other board members, realize who the stakeholders are, what the balance of their different interests and imperatives are, and actually make a difference very, very quickly in order to justify your position.
Well, Stuart, I want to come back to career diversification in a second, but you said something early on where I just maybe a little bit of a plot twist here, and I knew this but kind of forgot. You were in the hedge fund space very, very early. And since the global financial crisis up until maybe 21, there's risk on trade alive and well. The central banks pinned rates to zero, trillions of dollars of liquidity flooding in. And I think the hedge funds, to some extent, were operating with one arm tied behind their back. And when they didn't keep pace with the S&P 500, the FT and many other people were up in arms. How dare they, when it's supposed to be a diversified play? What are your views on the hedge fund space? I can maybe preempt with mine, and it's become a very, very complex industry, and you got to do your due diligence, but there are still a lot of very, very good managers there. And I think we're at a stage in the market where maybe hedging some of the risk premia out while you still have some exposure is maybe a sensible thing to do. So I want to come back to the career side, but I think maybe talking about the current state of affairs in the space.
Bill, I'm very happy to do that. I sometimes find myself unthinkingly slipping into explaining to people why I got involved in the crypto asset space. Aside from the positives about being in a space that is in the midst of such rapid change and development and so intellectually stimulating, as well as having tremendous opportunities to make investment gains, I sometimes say, oh my gosh, hedge funds have become so institutionalized, they're boring. The reality is they're not. And one of the hedge fund ventures in which I'm involved involves people applying, if you will, a synthesis of a very heavy body of continuing academic work within academia with a bunch of industry practitioners, bringing what I'd call authentic AI to bear on management. When I last saw the chief executive of that firm, I was saying the reality is that there is just as much excitement in the hedge fund space as there ever was. You just need to know where to look for it. I say that in two regards. One is that if you look at developments in AI, if you look at some of the continuing developments in quant, if you look at some of what's going on in the quantum space, just between those three, and then you merge them with the very serious work that is being done to try and bring ESG considerations in their different manifestations to bear on hedge fund management, that's more than enough by way of interest value. There is stuff that's interesting. The other regard in which it's interesting, and it may be from you, if not, it was from someone else equally authoritative, that I heard the stat that no less than about a third, it is estimated, of all hedge fund activity doesn't show up on any of the databases that people draw on in order to talk about industry aggregates. And from my own experience, I don't know whether it's a third or a fifth or whatever. It's always been my experience throughout my career that all of a sudden you run into someone who's managing a hedge fund book or a series of portfolios with $5 billion behind it, and you've never heard of them. I don't know why my voice broke, but it always astonishes me. I'll be at a reception in Geneva or a bar in New York, and suddenly I'll meet someone, and this is for real. And so there's more going on than meets the eye. A lot of people are managing pools where they don't have to publicize anything. And I'm not even talking about just the private pools, but they just don't need to publicize anything. Why should they? And so I think actually hedge fund performance intuitively is likely to be a little understated. Otherwise, people won't even.
No, I agree with that. And I've read something this morning that there's a very exclusive club. I don't know if it's at the MBA level or undergrad at Harvard, where you have to be a student to get in. And there's also a 2-part rigorous interview to be able to join. And this hedge fund club has graduated people into the upper echelons of alternative investments in the industry as a whole. And their numbers have done very well, absolute and risk adjusted. And that's a fund you cannot get into either. So it's interesting that I think you got to do your homework, do your due diligence. To say that this industry has run its course is so short-sighted. And I think like anything else, there are great diversification plays out there. You have to do your homework. Manager selection, due diligence, critically important.
Look, it's also easy to say, oh my gosh, all the opportunities, all the persistent opportunities have been arbed out. That's just nonsense. Look at the ebb and flow, just taking one very mainstream, albeit broad strategy, macro. In any given year, it's either totally out of fashion or it's totally in. That's because the markets just aren't efficient in the way that people assume they are. And it doesn't take genius to work that out. There continue to be so many opportunities, even in the mainstream markets, let alone in esoterica. So anyone who thinks that the hedge fund thing is over is foolish. I was asked this question yesterday. Is crypto a new asset class? I think it is. I think it is to some extent sui generis, and I don't agree. That happens to be the Aaro House view, but it's also my view. I do not agree that the move of the correlations to one temporarily last year had any meaning. I think it was coincidence rather than causation. I happen to think that that space is still sufficiently small and self-contained to be driven more by endogenous than exogenous or external factors. I don't think it's all about the macro backdrop. Therefore, I wouldn't put it in the same space as other asset classes. I think the correlation arguments still hold in its favor. But 7 to 10 years from now, you'll probably get some compression of returns, some compression of the behavior of that asset class, and ultimately it may merge with others. That can happen. And then there will be something new coming along.
Well, it's the old saying, the only thing that goes up in a down market are correlations. I think you got to look at this over longer periods of time. And I think
Well, I think so. I think you're right.
And you find alpha in deep pockets of inefficiency. And the digital asset space, broadly speaking, is hugely inefficient right now. And
Yes.
And you mentioned these large language models and ChatGPT and generative AI, and we're in the early innings of this, but this is going to bring a great amount of data and inefficiencies. And for the right manager, I think there's breeding ground for alpha.
Now, there are people who are saying that virtually all analysts' jobs will go out the window. I'm not sure that's the case. I think that within a very few years, certainly people younger than you or I will be walking into the room, flicking a switch, and the light will come on. It'll be as simple as that. They'll simply be doing stuff at a level beyond us and probably beyond our capacity to imagine it. But one thing that really does come through my experience over the last decades, through my career, is the following. When I first got involved in hedge funds, and it wasn't the first thing that I'd done in my career, I remember saying to my wife and to my friends, oh my goodness, it's got to the stage where I can no longer plan what I'm doing a year from now. I thought that was remarkable. And then I'd laughingly say, so forget about 6 months or 3 months. I don't know what's happening. It's now got to the point where I think in the digital space, and to some extent in the hedge fund space, you're no longer dealing with volatility in the form that we grew up with it. It's almost more like you're dealing with the volatility of the volatility. And even beyond that, it's almost like the velocity of the volatility of the volatility. Yep. Things are happening so quickly that when I look back 20 and more years ago to the hedge fund space when it was younger, and I would go around talking to people when the industry was still comparatively small, and run into all sorts of authoritative people who'd say, goodness, what a set of learning curves I'm going through about themselves. Things are changing so quickly. In comparison, the digital space is happening so fast that I don't think there is any sane or reasonable person who can maintain that they know everything there is to know about it.
Yeah, certainly, absolutely.
And that's part of the excitement. But so far as it relates to anyone and their career, if I was to give any advice at all, it is to try to think creatively about what you're likely to need in future, not in the immediate future, but in future, when you get beyond whatever the phase of your career happens to be. Now, whether that's expressed through things that are but your career or outside, make the space, create the time to do those things. It's not just a matter of studying, it's also a matter of doing if you can. For some people, this is a baleful reality. For others, it's a benign one. But we are, on the whole, living longer. Those of us who are fortunate enough to be affluent and well enough fed and catered for health-wise. Bill, you and I have talked about this. I don't think either you or I, in principle, has any intention of relenting until we're at an age that once upon a time would have been inconceivably old. I hope to be a real old git in my 80s.
As do I. And I think that maybe I'll formulate maybe this last couple minutes into a question, Stuart, on this theme, which I promised to get back to. I took us on a little bit of a worthy detour here. But when I think about work-life balance, the way I describe it to my kids or anybody I'm talking to is that I worked my tail off in my 30s and 40s, my 20s, I guess, for that matter. So I'd have more balance in my 50s and 60s. And I took things on that I had no business taking on. They were out of my sweet spot, out of my skill set. Maybe failure was an option. And I just learned a ton. And it allowed me to sort of get involved in a lot of different things. And I now going to be almost 10 years at Kaya and will be at the end of this year. And maybe this was not perfect planning, but it worked out maybe by dumb luck in that it's opened up a global network of people and opportunities. And there's so many things that interest me in the next 20 or 30 years. But if you came to me today and you had the same job, Stuart, for the entirety of your career, and you're saying, hey, yeah, I want to open doors and find an interesting way of managing the latter part of my 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I would sort of try to find a polite way of saying, Stuart, I think you're out of time. You got to be planning for this. And it's gotten very, very hard. The pace of change has gotten very, very difficult. And you have been a master at this. You've got a whole collection of things from the radio show to the executive board positions and other aspects of your career that are still with you. So maybe in closing, Stuart, is there, other than starting early and being curious, is there advice that you would leave the audience with about how they really can prepare themselves for a successful 30 years of career post the age of 60?
Well, I really do think it is about diversification. And the easiest way to do that, or the most comfortable way to do that, is to do stuff that you like. These are very first principles things. And if you like the idea of helping people, get involved in charities. Don't wait to get to the age that you think people need to be at to start doing serious charity work or getting involved on charity boards, whether it's that or some sort of community organization or advocacy organization, or get involved in something cultural. Or if your thing is sport, do that. But it's almost a matter of taking all the stuff that you would do for fun or for enjoyment or for deeper satisfaction and bundling that into coherent activity, because that means that you have a platform from which to jump off when doing the 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. job is no longer there. And I think that's the best way to address what you've raised. Unless you're exceptionally talented, well-connected, or lucky, you're not necessarily going to find it so easy to come off a linear career path and then start competing with everyone else for non-executive board positions.
Yeah, no, I agree.
In fact, I have avoided going into that space because everyone I grew up with professionally who's no longer doing like a full-time thing is competing. There are thousands of them competing with one another in London, New York, and elsewhere. And heck, why should I be competing with them? And if you want to stay really engaged, as you're getting older, get executive positions, not non-executive ones. Actually do the stuff. Don't just take nominal responsibility for them.
Yeah, and I think that's a great closing observation, because while the for-profit world or that executive director position might be a little bit more difficult, there are a lot of non-for-profit impactful causes out there. And to think of them as charities is short-sighted. In many cases, they could be global businesses that need the executive leadership that you might have had in the course of your career. And you could find yourself not only contributing in a meaningful way, it's going to open up a whole new network for you as well.
Absolutely.
So I think that is very good.
Bill, in closing from my side, I didn't do the radio show. I didn't start the radio show 15 years ago in order to build a profile or in order to build up a network. But goodness sake, it sure as heck means that I travel the world now. If I meet someone interesting or if someone comes well introduced, I can ask them if I feel like it, will you come on the radio show? The worst they can do is say no. But bingo, it opens all sorts of doors. And one of the charities I got involved in that just comes to mind turned out, and I didn't even realize this beforehand, to be the largest non-UN affiliated education and technical training NGO in the world. And what I learned from that, it was like being involved in running a multinational, because it literally was.
You know, I think good advice, and I wish we had another half hour, but maybe to be continued on the Naked Short. But certainly, that's a great platform, and I'll encourage the listeners here to find you over there. But thanks for your time, and I enjoyed turning the tables on you. Hopefully, it was not too painful from your side.
Bill, I can only thank you for allowing me to participate in this. And as ever, many of your listeners are involved in studying. Keep that up. That's pretty damned important, and it will pay back. It will pay back.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for listening to Educational Alpha. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Learn more about the Kaya Association and subscribe to the show at kaya.org. That's CAIA.org. See you next time.